Voyagers were guaranteed to work only until the Saturn encounter. I thought it might be a good idea, just after Saturn, to have them take one last glance homeward. From Saturn, I knew, the Earth would appear too small for Voyager to make out any detail. Our planet would be just a point of light, a lonely pixel, hardly distinguishable from the many other points of light Voyager would see, nearby planets, far-off suns. But precisely because of the obscurity of our world thus revealed, such a picture might be worth having. While almost everyone is taught that the Earth is a sphere, with all of us somehow glued to it by gravity, the reality of our circumstance did not really begin to sink in until the famous frame-filling Apollo photograph of the whole Earth, the one taken by the Apollo 17 astronauts on the last journey of humans to the moon. It seemed to me that another picture of the Earth, this one taken from 100,000 times farther away, might help in the continuing process of revealing to ourselves our true circumstance and condition. It had been well understood by the scientists and philosophers of classical antiquity that the Earth was a mere point in a vast, encompassing cosmos. But no one had ever seen it as such. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit? Yes. Settle? Not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. Voyagers were guaranteed to work only until the Saturn encounter. I thought it might be a good idea, just after Saturn, to have them take one last glance homeward. From Saturn, I knew, the Earth would appear too small for Voyager to make out any detail. Our planet would be just a point of light, a lonely pixel, hardly distinguishable from the many other points of light Voyager would see, nearby planets, far-off suns. But precisely because of the obscurity of our world thus revealed, such a picture might be worth having. While almost everyone is taught that the Earth is a sphere, with all of us somehow glued to it by gravity, the reality of our circumstance did not really begin to sink in until the famous frame-filling Apollo photograph of the whole Earth, the one taken by the Apollo 17 astronauts on the last journey of humans to the moon. It seemed to me that another picture of the Earth, this one taken from 100,000 times farther away, might help in the continuing process of revealing to ourselves our true circumstance and condition. It had been well understood by the scientists and philosophers of classical antiquity that the Earth was a mere point in a vast, encompassing cosmos. But no one had ever seen it as such. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit? Yes. Settle? Not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known.
he's been the most effective promoter of the concept of the Mars mission, jointly with the Soviets, and you might possibly hear something about that tonight. But another role that Carl has had is that of Cassandra. Most of you, I think, remember your mythology well enough to know that Cassandra was given a fate by the gods. The fate was to be able to foretell the future, but the second half of that fate was never to be believed. Now, Carl has been a very effective Cassandra. I hope people will begin to believe him, because some of the things he's been pointing out to the human race more effectively than any other scientist I know is, for example, the great perils the human race is facing, and in particular the nuclear arms race, and even more particularly nuclear winter as one of the possible consequences, or at least a nuclear fall may be the answer. Anyway, the point is this is a very important role, and again, very few scientists play it or play it effectively. I hope all of you have seen the Parade article from last February, which spelled out some of the reasons why the Soviets have cause to be worried about the United States and vice versa, an article published in the Soviet Union as well as here. So we have a Cassandra with us tonight. But now, to wrap up, I am not infrequently asked by people who don't know, they say, gee, everybody knows Carl, but is he a scientist? And the answer is, oh my, yes. Carl is one of the leading lights in the planetary realm of science in the world today. Just to mention a few high spots of his work, not necessarily the ones he would pick, he was the first scientist who pointed out that Venus must be hot, with really cogent reasons for it, before missions really got there to land on it. He was the first scientist to realize the character of dust on Mars and the immensely important role it has to play in what we observe there, long before missions really landed there. Done fundamental work in the systematics of planets around other stars, in the chemistry of clouds in the solar system. He heads a very lively scientific research group in these areas and others at Cornell. Carl is very, very much a scientist. After this introduction, you may think that I agree with Carl on everything. Well, almost. Not quite. I believe we need to go to the moon before we go to Mars, but I realize there's another point of view on that. Carl has the floor tonight, and I think he'll do a pretty good job of presenting his case. So it's a great pleasure. Carl, please join us.
Harlan, thank you very much for that extremely generous introduction. I'm most happy to be here in this elegant lecture hall and to have an opportunity to talk to people from the Austin community, including members of the Planetary Society, and also planetary scientists who are attending the annual meeting of the Division for Planetary Sciences of the American Astronomical Society here in Austin. I have to say something about Lyndon Johnson, since this whole building and this lecture hall is named after him. There are lots of things to say about him. But I think I will just mention his remark. He made a number of them about space, but there was one that I find especially important. He said that the military reconnaissance satellites were worth the cost of the entire space program. And I heartily agree with that, because those satellites have the extremely important role of calming the hotheads and paranoids on both sides, who, if given full rein, would manage to do us in. And in fact, the issue of war is a part of what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about Mars, but as you know, Mars is named after the god of war, and I hope to have a chance to explore a number of different connections between Mars and war. I'll try not to be too long, because I'm very much looking forward to the question period, since by and large I've heard this talk before. It's It's the question period that's likely to have provocative and challenging questions, and therefore some degree of real stimulation for me. Mars in Roman mythology was the god of war. The Romans and the Greeks before them, who called that god Ares, had to personify the idea of war because it seemed to come unawares on people. It seemed to come from outside them. Afterwards, they would look and say, how could we have been so foolish? But at the time, they were captured by it, caught up in it. The reason that Mars, that particular world, was named after the god of war is speculative, but the prevailing wisdom is that the connection comes from the color. Mars is red, clearly red to the naked eye, as most of you have doubtless noticed in the last few months. And blood is red, and blood is spilled in war, and so maybe that's the connection. The reason Mars is red, incidentally, is because it's rusty, because it has iron oxides on its surface, and it is true that the reason blood is red is because it has iron chelated in the hemoglobin molecule. So, by a curious coincidence, the chemistry is more or less correct. Tonight, or I forget, maybe tomorrow night, is the 50th anniversary of the famous Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938, which panicked millions of Americans who had not yet made the distinction between media fiction and real-world fact. That distinction has still to be clearly made in American life. 1938 was the time that Hitler was strutting over Europe. It's the time of Munich. It's the time of the Sudeten crisis. It's the time where the fear of invasion was in the minds of lots of Europeans and, by extension, in the minds of Americans. So the report, done in dramatic, although time-compressed style, that Martians had landed in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, and were busy using Star Wars technology to destroy everyone who came near, was taken very seriously. And there were people who raced in their cars to the mountains, abandoning wives and children, and other useful revelations of character. And Orson Welles himself, who was in his early 20s when he produced this thing, was astonished at how many people took seriously what he had imagined as a Halloween fantasy. Now, the Orson Welles radio program was based upon an H.G. Wells novel, also called The War of the Worlds, and that in turn was based, in a way, on real astronomy, semi-real astronomy, namely the work of Percival Lowell, an American scientist who established an observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, who had mapped what he believed were canals on the surface of Mars. He drew maps of single and double straight lines, unerringly crossing vast expanses of Martian terrain with uncanny rectilinearity, straightness. And he argued that no natural process could produce such unerringly straight lines, that the straightness of the lines was a clear indication of their artificiality. that they were produced by intelligent life on Mars. And he had a story as to a hypothesis, a model of how that came about. Mars was a dying planet. Its smaller gravity did not permit it to retain an atmosphere of the same density of the Earth. And so it was parched and withered, the water having largely escaped to space. And Martians who had evolved in previous epochs of the history of that planet were engaged in a vast water reclamation project in which the melting polar caps each spring were connected with the canal network, and the water was redirected to the thirsty inhabitants of the equatorial cities. And Lowell went quite far in his deductions. For example, he deduced from the fact that the straight lines go enormous distances, and therefore, if it were the same as the Earth, would cross international boundaries, that Mars did not have international boundaries, that it was a planetary society. He even deduced what its political system was, and pinpointed the capital. It was a place where lots of canals emerged. Well, as I've said on another occasion, the argument is almost entirely right. There is no question that the straightness of the canals is compelling evidence for their intelligent origin. The only point at issue is which side of the telescope the intelligence was on. And we now recognize that it was our side, not the Martian side of the telescope. The canals do not exist. They are a snare and a delusion. Some terrible vulnerability, weakness of the human hand-eye-brain system led Lowell, under conditions of imperfect seeing, and not just Lowell, by the way, but a bunch of other astronomers, to probably connect up disconnected fine detail into straight lines and deduce canals where there are none. But that was not definitively established until the Mariner 9 mission to Mars in 1971, although it was certainly the prevailing view of the astronomical community. But Lowell was so effective a popularizer of his work and so passionate in his conclusions, and the idea is so entrancing that this nearby planetary neighbor has a global civilization of technological beings who are somehow our older brothers, that the idea took on a life of its own. And in 1897, H.G. Wells wrote one of the classic and also one of the earliest science fiction novels, in which the Percival Lowell Martians were given a fictional but very potent manifestation. The idea was that, yes, they're running out of water, and they cast their eyes enviously, was the way that Wells described it, at nearby worlds. Are there any that have lots of water? Oh my goodness, look at this one. This blue one over here. They have more water than they know what to do with. Let's take them over. And so the account was about how earthbound astronomers found puffs of smoke and flashes of light on Mars, and then strange vehicles were seen in the skies of Earth. They landed, strange tentacled Martians equipped with hydrogen bomb-driven X-ray lasers or the equivalent, then utterly destroyed the primitive armaments of the Brits For H.G. Wells, they landed in England. For Orson Welles, they landed in New Jersey. And both the novel and the radio broadcast ended with the Earth helpless in the clutches of malevolent and extremely thirsty Martians. Which brings to mind now H.G. Wells's approach was not just for science fiction. He was making a strong political point. And his political point was that Britain, he was British, had to first order, this was late Victorian age, conquered the world. I can recall an 1897 Queen Victoria Jubilee postage stamp from Canada, which has on it a greater empire than has ever been. Mercator projection of the Earth, and red everywhere. In those days, red meant British. And you could see all over the world, significant fraction of the Earth's surface was under the British Imperium. Wells mentions in his novel the great cost of this British conquest, including the extermination of the Tasmanian Aborigines, who were hunted as if they were wild animals and rendered absolutely extinct by British colonists, many of them sent to Tasmania instead of to jail. Wells was trying to give us a sense of the tables turned, of what it would be like if we had the inadequate military technology, if beings far in advance of us were to come here. Just the perspective of Tasmanian Aborigines and Zulus and people all over the world to the British superior military technology. Okay, so it ends sort of badly for humans. It's distressing. It's not upbeat. In fact, the Wells novel was not to the American taste at all. And that is why, 1 year later, a sequel was published without, as far as I know, any permission from H.G. Wells, by an American popularizer of astronomy and well-known writer named Garrett Serviss. And his novel was called Edison's Conquest of Mars. The Edison is Thomas A. Edison. You know, the electric light and phonographs, movies. Mars. This book praises Yankee ingenuity, as exemplified by Thomas Edison, and picks up where Wells left off. Thomas Edison discovers that Great Britain has been conquered by Martians, puts aside for a brief period his other technological efforts, and then not only succeeds in utterly defeating the Martians on Earth, but he then arranges for a human invasion of Mars. And we turn the tables back. And everything works out wonderfully for us, but not so well for the Martians. This was, by the way, written on the eve of the Spanish-American War. Now, Thomas Edison was, of course, by this time already a legendary figure. This is why Serviss inducted him, perhaps unwillingly, to play the title role in his novel. And there's a most interesting sequel to this. The connection between Martian astronomy and science fiction and the real world of the Earth are strangely intertwined. Because when World War I rolled around, there was in many popular circles, in part because of the service book, the expectation that Thomas Edison, having quickly dispatched the Martians, could easily handle the Kaiser. And a general sigh of relief was heard when a letter was published from the Secretary of the Navy, written to Edison and asking him to supervise military research and development in the First World War. And let me quote from that letter. By the way, this aspect of Edison is from a first-rate new book by Bruce Franklin called War Stars, the Superweapon and the American Imagination, just being published by Oxford University Press. Here's an excerpt from the letter by the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, in 1915, to Thomas Edison. "We are confronted with a new and terrible engine of warfare in the submarine. With your own wonderful brain to aid us, the United States will be able to meet this new danger with new devices that will assure peace to our country." Well, Edison enlisted. There seems to have been absolutely no significant weapons that emerged from Edison's organization. But nevertheless, it had the greatest historical importance because it was the first attempt in the United States to create, under government aegis, a partnership of academic science, industry, and the armed forces in order to fight a war. It played no role in the First World War, but it played an absolutely key role in winning the Second World War, and led, after 1945, to the institutionalization of what Dwight Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell address as the military-industrial complex. And in that short interim, its most celebrated products were radar, proximity fuse, nuclear weapons, and rocket delivery systems. That is, there is a fun causality loop in which the imagined Martians coming to Earth lead to the development of the technology which permits humans to go to Mars. I don't say that it wouldn't have happened without it, but still, that's something sort of cute. I think these inventions would have been developed had Wells and Service and Edison never lived, but maybe not so quickly. The timing, nature, and governmental acceptance of this partnership would have been different. So Mars, in perhaps just a small but nevertheless interesting sense, has played a role in the origin of the nuclear arms race, which, if left unhindered, promises to defeat the human species more comprehensively than the Martian cabal ever could. It would be fitting if Mars, therefore, could help end the nuclear arms race, if the planet named after the god of war could play some role in helping to bring peace to the Earth. And I want to talk about that possibility a little later. And this, by the way, is not the only connection between Mars and war, and I'll mention a few others. Now, pages fall from the calendar, and I would like to reconstruct a little of our history starting in the late 1950s. Well, let me start in 1945. The United States invents nuclear weapons and long-range strategic bombers. The Soviet Union huffs and puffs to catch up. The two of them develop long-range strategic rockets at almost in a dead heat. The two of them develop thermonuclear weapons almost in a dead heat. The United States is stunned in 1957 when Sputnik 1 is launched the first artificial satellite of the Earth, launched with a rocket developed for strategic purposes. Strategic purposes means developed to carry a nuclear weapon over large distances to kill an obscene number of people. The United States is further stunned by the first orbital flight of Yuri Gagarin, a cosmonaut carrying a Soviet passport, although he didn't need the passport to do it, there not being any customs stations in low Earth orbit. What I'm trying to say is that it was a Soviet citizen who was the first human being in space. And this produced a crisis of confidence in the United States. First off, there was the sense that where did the Soviets come off being the first to do this? This is, by rights, what we should be doing first. Then there was the concern that those other nations would think that all the other nations would think the United States was not as good as the Soviets in this sort of high technology, and would redound to some diplomatic difficulties for the United States. But the most serious aspect of it was that here the Soviets had demonstrated a heavy lift capability, which if it could lift Yuri Gagarin into Earth orbit, it could certainly lift a thermonuclear weapon halfway around the planet. And so the key concern about the beginning of the, quote, space race was Soviet strategic superiority. That was the concern. The reality is something else. And in fact, when John Kennedy was running for the presidency in 1960 against Richard Nixon, one of his principal arguments, most potent arguments, was that the Eisenhower-Nixon administration had permitted a, quote, missile gap, close quote, to develop, in which the Soviets had deployed large numbers of intercontinental missiles with strategic warheads, and the United States did not, and the Soviet Union might make a first strike against the United States and utterly destroy us. And how could they have done such a thing? How could they have been so careless with the national defense? Then after Kennedy won the election, he assigned his science advisor Jerome Wiesner to look into how bad the missile gap was, and Wiesner reported back in a few weeks that there certainly was a missile gap, but it went the other way. The Soviets had 2 deployed rockets, and the United States many. And but that has to do with presidential politics, which I guess I won't get into. Nevertheless, the United States felt it was essential to make some major response on the world stage to these striking Soviet advances in space. And in the early years of the Kennedy administration, few months of the Kennedy administration, a wide range of alternatives was debated. And some were rejected as being too ambitious, some were rejected as not being dramatic enough, and the compromise that was agreed upon, extremely daring in retrospect, was that the United States would announce, the United States that had not put a person into orbit, would announce that before the end of the decade of the 1960s, the United States would land a man, a human being, on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. And that was what Kennedy, in a famous speech, announced the United States would do. Now, if you consider the state of the American space program at that time, the state of rocketry, the state of control systems, the state of navigation, rocket reliability, it was a very daring gamble. And yet, sure as shooting, July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on Mare Tranquillitatis and fulfilled that promise of the now dead President Kennedy. And a major role in accomplishing that was played first as vice president and then as president by the man after whom this hall and building are named. Now, President Kennedy in that speech did not say that the objective was to find out the chemical composition of Mare Tranquillitatis by the end of the decade of the 1960s. He did not say it was even to understand the origin of the moon by any time scale. It was simply to land somebody and to bring the somebody back. It had nothing to do with science. Science was not part of this. This was politics. If some science got done, that was all to the good. But the Apollo program was not science. It was about the strategic confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And Kennedy made a deal with his science advisor, Jerome Wiesner. Or rather, Wiesner made a deal with Kennedy. And the way the deal went was this. As long, Mr. President, as you don't claim this is science, I will support it. I believe that the only way that NASA can emerge from the serious difficulties that it's in is by the President of the United States, the next President of the United States, reinvigorating NASA by giving it such a coherent, overarching goal. And I would like to propose such a goal which I believe works on every level. That goal is a program of step-by-step, progressive exploration of Mars jointly with the Soviet Union and other nations, culminating in the first footfall on another planet by representatives of the human species. Why with the Soviet Union? Because I maintain this won't happen unless there is an overriding political purpose, just as for Apollo. But for the United States and the Soviet Union to demonstrate that they can annihilate each other is unnecessary. They have extremely well demonstrated that to each other and to the world. They have, in fact, booby-trapped the planet with 60,000 nuclear weapons, only a tiny fraction of which is necessary to do us in. What they must do now is to demonstrate the opposite. Demonstrate that they are able to work together in high technology on behalf of the human species with a goal that can capture the imagination of people worldwide, that can make the transition from the 20th to the 21st century, from second to the third millennium, in a way to the human species, to people all over the earth. Such a program combines a wide range of constituencies within NASA and their counterparts on the Soviet side. Long-duration spaceflight, Earth orbital construction and staging of spacecraft, solar physics, because you have to worry about getting zapped on the way to Mars, unmanned robotic, by the way, when I say manned, I mean manned and womaned, but there's no satisfactory word for that. For a while I was using the word crewed, C-R-E-W-E-D, but that leads to misunderstandings. So if I say manned, I want to stress that I believe that not only is there a role, there is a central and vital role for women as well as men in going to Mars. Among other things, the men will go crazy. Where was I? Yes, and robotic planetary exploration because clearly we have to know a great deal more about Mars and its moons, which are possible staging platforms, but they're connected with comets and asteroids before we will go there. In other words, were we to have such a national, in this case international commitment, the net result would be that we would have that umbrella, have that aegis that we used to have in the Apollo days, and I think there could be a renaissance, another golden age in planetary exploration. How likely is it that this will happen? Well, we have been talking this up for the last 4 years, and there's been some remarkable progress. For one thing, Mr. Gorbachev has signed on. I don't mean himself to go, but he has, in a number of public forums, indicated his support, vigorous support, for joint Soviet-American exploration on Mars. I was at a meeting at the Soviet Embassy during the Washington summit last year, in which somebody, not me, asked Mr. Gorbachev a very general question. What do you think, the questioner asked, would be a useful and important joint activity that the Soviet Union and the United States could do to make clear a change in their relationship? And the first thing out of his mouth was, let's go to Mars together. There are bills before Congress that have the same import, including senses of Congress resolutions that have passed. Both candidates in the present race have indicated, cautiously, but indicated quite clearly their considerable interest in this, and you can see in the latest issue of the Planetary Report those statements. There is a most interesting recent poll by Market Opinion Research in Washington, D.C., in which a demographically controlled sample of 1,200 registered voter households was asked, do you think a joint U.S.-USSR manned mission to Mars would work? I mean, technically. And the answer was yes by 63%. And then they were asked, if a joint U.S.-USSR manned mission to Mars could work, would you favor it? 72% said yes. The same sample was asked, if we are to have manned missions to Mars, do you think it should be an independent U.S. program? 31% said yes. Do you think it should be the U.S. sending people on board a Russian spacecraft? 3% said yes. Should it be U.S. joint participation with the Soviets as equals? 54% said yes. And then the Planetary Society has been circulating the so-called Mars Declaration, which talks about such things and has gotten a remarkable bipartisan consensus of American leaders on that. That's also been published by the Planetary Society. And so I say there is reason to think this may actually happen. And if so, there will be a wonderful renaissance in the exploration of the solar system. The cost looks to be, depends very much on how many people go and so on, about as much as a single major strategic weapons system, which the United States and the Soviet Union blithely produce large numbers of. The technical step from where we are today to such a mission, I believe, is no greater than the technical step from President Kennedy's 1961 speech to the Armstrong-Aldrin landing in 1969. No one is proposing that it be done in a short period of 8 years. I think we should do it cautiously for all sorts of reasons, including testing out the U.S.-Soviet relationship. And sometime in the first decade of the 21st century sounds like the right time. So finally, imagine how it might be. You can't launch from the surface of the Earth to Mars, so the United States and the Soviet Union jointly construct one or more spacecraft in Earth orbit. It takes a year or two to do it. There they are, with stars and stripes and hammers and sickles, turning screws and welding in Earth orbit. All of that on the evening news every night, if you want. Scientists, engineers, astronauts and cosmonauts of the two nations, and with representatives of other nations as well, working together in a common endeavor on behalf of the human species. Then the spacecraft are completed, the crews board, the spacecraft are launched, long interplanetary journey between the Earth and Mars. Russians owing their lives to Americans doing things right. Americans owing their lives to Russians doing things right. A microcosm of the actual circumstance down here on Earth, in which we in this room, for example, owe the fact that we're still alive to the fact that nobody did something stupid 20 minutes ago in Moscow. And likewise, the other way around. Then injection in Mars orbit, deboost from Mars orbit, landing on the surface of Mars. There are some who are concerned about which nation first sets foot on Mars. I have a solution to that. You tie the ankles of the American and Soviet commanders together, and in the 0.38 gravity, they softly fall to the ground. And then imagine the exploration of Mars. In my mind's eye, I imagine a wheeled or tracked vehicle with 2 or 3 or 4 explorers in it, wandering down an ancient Martian river valley, cameras and geological hammers at the ready, looking for fossils, trying to understand how it is that Mars once had a climate which permitted running water and today it does not. All of that, all of those discoveries, because Mars is a world of wonders, it will oblige being sent back for the delectation of the evening television audience on Earth every day. And then maybe months of such exploration, maybe only weeks, and then the long journey back home. I maintain if you then add what has to be done before that, including robotic exploratory roving vehicles on Mars and robotic sample return from Mars to Earth, which you would certainly want to precede sending humans there, you could have a historic, adventuresome period of 15, 20 years of the nations of the Earth, led by the United States and the Soviet Union, involved in the exploration of Mars. And of course, it would not end there. That would be only the beginning. It's hard to think of a historically more significant endeavor. I think that in the long run, the binding up of the wounds on Earth and the exploration of Mars might go hand in hand, each activity aiding the other. The wonders of Mars will occupy us for a long time. Its surface area is equal to the entire land area of the Earth. The first voyage of men and women from our planet to Mars is the key step in transforming us into a multi-planet species. A step, it seems to me, as momentous as the colonization of the land by our amphibian ancestors some 500 million years ago, and the descent from the trees by our primate ancestors perhaps 5 or 10 million years ago. Decades ago, Mars called to the Soviet spaceflight pioneer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and to his American counterpart, Robert Goddard, both of whom, by the way, were influenced by Percival Lowell and H.G. Wells. The rockets they designed, and they were the principal designers of the spacecraft we have today, were intended not for the destruction of life on Earth, but to take us to the planets and the stars. is there not some special obligation that the two principal spacefaring nations, the two nations that have burdened our planet with 60,000 nuclear weapons, have to put things right, to use this technology for good and not for evil, to blaze, on behalf of every human being, the trail to Mars and beyond? Thank you. Okay, I'll now try to answer questions. If anybody in control of the lights can hear me, could you turn up the lights in the audience so I can see people? And then, I don't know how the acoustics are here, but let's give it a... Sorry? Oh, we have mics? Where are the mics? I'll put on my glasses. Oh, good. Okay, then could I ask those who wish to ask questions to just line up by the mics, and I'll try to call on you. Microphone there and there. Yes, please.
I should like to know, you mentioned that you thought that both sexes should go on this particular operation, the women so that the men won't go crazy. I should like to know why that men shouldn't go so the women astronauts wouldn't go crazy. I have a selfish motive for saying this.
I am in entire agreement with what you said.
I have a selfish motive for saying this in that I am a basketball coach, not an engineer, so I couldn't go as a technician. I have to go as the other way, and I'd like to go to Mars myself. The real reason I'm up here is to ask you just exactly, between the United States and the Russians, how much of this technology necessary to go to Mars do we have, and how much are we going to have to invent as we go along? Thank you.
That's all parts of what you said are good. Well, let's think. First of all, you need a big booster. If, for example, we were stuck with shuttle technology, then it would take some 20, maybe 30 shuttle payloads brought up into low Earth orbit that you then have to combine in order to make a minimal payload that could get humans to Mars. So that seems very burdensome. It'd be nice to have a really big booster. Soviets have a really big booster. It's Saturn V class. Saturn V was the launcher that we used to have in the Apollo days, but we threw away because the Apollo stunt was done. It's called Energia, and it exists, but only in the hands of the Soviets. In addition, you want to have lots of experience with long-duration spaceflight. If it takes a year to get to Mars, you don't want the first time that your astronauts have been a year in space to be on that trip. You want to do it in Earth orbit. The Soviets are the only ones who have been in space for something approaching a year. So they're way ahead in that as well. You want to have a lot of experience in the robotic exploration of Mars. The United States has not sent anything to Mars since 1976. The Soviets have 2 spacecraft, one of them's failed, going to Mars at this moment, and have an extremely ambitious mission ready to go in '94. We have Mars Observer, which is not an extremely ambitious, extremely modest mission. So in these respects, we see that there is an asymmetry. The Soviets seem to be far ahead of us in a number of areas that are important to go to Mars. And by the way, this bears on the issue of technology transfer. Some people say, oh, we can't do it with the Russians because they'll steal our technology. Well, in this particular case, it might flow the other way as much as in that direction. But there's nothing that prevents the United States from having astronauts in Earth orbit for a year or two if we build the right kind of space station. There is nothing that prevents us from having a very vigorous robotic exploration of Mars, including roving vehicles and return sample missions. There's nothing that prevents us from having a heavy lift vehicle. And all of these things are being proposed, in many cases by people who are not necessarily thinking about sending humans to Mars. So all of that can be done. There's certainly work that has to be done in human physiology, in protecting astronauts from the high energy charged particles and solar flares, kind of storm cellar to go into in a solar flare emergency. There are a lot of things that have to be done. There is no showstopper among them as far as I can see. Yes.
I just wanted to tell you I found your talk fascinating.
Thank you.
My question is two parts. First, of all the planets in our solar system, and given your knowledge of them, if you were to pick one to go live on, which one would it be and how?
Earth. By far my favorite one.
I'm just wondering if any of the other ones could possibly be made habitable should something happen to the Earth. And also, if SETI does eventually work, and I hope it does because I think there are beings out there, what do you think we ought to do if we make contact someday?
So two questions. For the first one, I would say that the planet most nearly habitable, we've got to do something, is Mars. And that's another one of the reasons why it's so attractive. The Moon, for example, or Venus are not in that particular category. What happens if we get a message from another civilization? Think about it, is what I say. But I've discussed in some detail how I imagine it might happen in my novel, Contact. So you could look up some more of it there. Yes?
I guess like everybody else in this room and everybody else around the world, we've been paying attention to what's been going on at the top of the world with the whales. I think that about the only thing we do as a planet besides make war up until the past 3 weeks has been the Olympic Games, our one planetary positive activity. To me, one of the really thrilling thing about the whales was that there was cooperation between groups that ordinarily really detest each other. The oil industry, the Eskimos, Greenpeace, the Soviets, the U.S. government. And there was this wonderful cooperation from very technical stuff, big helicopters that were trying to pull the special ships, to Russian icebreakers, to Eskimos with chainsaws, to two guys from the Great Lakes who brought their bubblers. What I'd like to ask you, and I think it was really heartwarming and really hopeful, and one of the thrilling things that I didn't get very much news coverage, but was that the Soviet icebreakers had both Soviet and American flags on the ships.
I didn't know that.
Yes. I just heard that report once. What I'd like to ask you is how you see cooperation from other countries besides the United States and the Soviet Union, like what happened with Giotto and the other probes into Halley's Comet, and also how you see a role not necessarily similar to the two guys who flew up to Alaska with their bubblers to keep the marina waters thawed out, but what we as individuals can do to help bring this inspiration that you've given us tonight about. Thank you.
Thank you. You've raised a number of issues. I'm not sure I will remember all of them. First off, let me say, while I agree with the general thrust of what you said, I think there are other signs that are encouraging in this kind of cooperation. And yes, Giotto, spacecraft of the European Space Agency, involving 13 European nations, is an example, but also the Soviet Vega 1 and Vega 2 spacecraft. that involved, forgotten, 11 nations from East and West Europe working together cooperatively, again, to approach Halley's Comet. But let's look at some other things. The INF Treaty, in which the United States and the Soviet Union agreed not only to destroy the boosters that correspond to, okay, it's only 3% of the nuclear weapons in the world, and they're not even destroying the nuclear weapons, just the boosters, but still better to go down than to go up. And also the idea that, that intrusive inspection is involved. Do you know that there are card-carrying communists in Utah outside a defense plant? And they're permitted to follow what goes in and out? And there are Americans outside a Soviet defense plant? And it's okay? Both nations have agreed. Also, there's the Stockholm Accords on conventional maneuvers in Europe. Soviets are doing a maneuver of 3 Warsaw Pact divisions in Belarus. The United States sends a message. We would like to send NATO military officers to watch it. According to the Stockholm Accord, the answer has to be delivered in 24 hours. 22 hours later, the engraved invitation, in effect, is sent. A light plane is provided. American Army officers fly into Belarus, are given, with their cameras and their recording instrument, they're given vehicles to inspect. And there are Americans watching Soviet maneuvers. And the other way, there's NATO maneuvers in northern Germany. And there are Soviet inspectors watching all this happening. And I spoke to an American officer who was there, and I said, how much difficulty was it? And he said, not nearly as much difficulty as the Newsweek reporter. So this kind of thing is happening. Or take the Montreal Protocol, in which the major industrial nations, both the users of and the producers of chlorofluorocarbons, got together to design a plan for the cutting down to zero of the manufacture of this danger to everybody on Earth. There's something happening. And I think the proposal for joint US-Soviet exploration on Mars is in that zeitgeist. It's consistent with it. It could actually happen. I mean, it's mind-boggling that any of these things are happening. But another way to look at it is if they don't happen, we're all goners. So it's a good thing it's happening. Yes.
Okay, obviously you support a mission to Mars as the next big step for our space program. But a lot of other people think that the moon should be the next step and setting up a moon base so that you can get experience with living and supporting people separate from the Earth while still being close enough to get help if something went wrong, instead of being a year's trip away.
Right.
So why would you not support a moon base as the next step?
Okay. So thank you for raising that, and let me try to address it. It's a perfectly sensible question, which has been raised by people of considerable eminence. So let's think about it. First off, there's the contention that this is a way of testing out our ability to do things on Mars, but in much safer circumstances. Why do you have to go to the moon to do that? Why not do it in Earth orbit? Even closer, even safer, even cheaper. If the idea is you want to see how humans can live on the moon for a long time, why not see how they live in Earth orbit for a long time? If the idea is you want to test equipment that will go to Mars, why not test it in Earth orbit or on the Earth? The moon is not a good model for Mars. Moon has no water, it has no air, its surface is quite different from that of Mars. It's not apparent that that's the way to go. If your ultimate objective is Mars. Now, another thing that worries me about the moon is that it's fabulously dull. Mars is a dynamic world where things change. There's an atmosphere, there are dust storms, there are seasonally varying polar caps. The moon is static, lifeless. Mars has the prospect for fossil life, and there are even some people who believe that we should continue looking for extant life. There's no one who proposes that for the moon. The prevailing American opinion after the Apollo program, looking at the moon rocks in the Smithsonian, was, looks just like a rock in my Aunt Tillie's backyard. That's what we spend $20 billion on? Nobody will have that sense about an exploratory set of exploratory missions to Mars. So I'm worried not only that the moon will deflect enormous resources and put going to Mars decades off, but that it will sour the public, who after all has to pay for this, on the whole idea, because the payoff will not be nearly as exciting as going to Mars. If Mars were in Earth orbit, we would not be having any difference of opinion right here. Be no question we should go to the Mars in Earth orbit rather than to the moon in Earth orbit. It is true that Mars is 100 times further away than the moon. It takes a lot longer to get to. I don't propose going there until we're ready, but I say a lunar base, which will cost $100 billion or something like that, will make going to Mars impossible, at least on the time scale I'm talking about. So that's the reason. Apart from that, all the business about why we should cooperate with the Russians on a grand adventure in space would apply to the moon equally well. I don't oppose it on those grounds at all. I just think it's a booby trap and will lead to a dead end, whereas Mars will occupy us for generations. Thank you. Yes.
On the list of people who I admire greatly, there's a number of people involved in space exploration, and I'm happy to say that they're highly placed on that list.
Thank you.
But among one of the people who I admire the greatest, back in the 1950s and 1960s, he was one of the leading public figures pushing for manned flights to the moon, and that was Wernher von Braun. Do you see yourself as the Martian von Braun of the 80s and 90s?
The Voyagers were guaranteed to work only until the Saturn encounter. I thought it might be a good idea, just after Saturn, to have them take one last glance homeward. From Saturn, I knew, the Earth would appear too small for Voyager to make out any detail. Our planet would be just a point of light, a lonely pixel, hardly distinguishable from the many other points of light Voyager would see, nearby planets, far-off suns. But precisely because of the obscurity of our world thus revealed, such a picture might be worth having. While almost everyone is taught that the Earth is a sphere, with all of us somehow glued to it by gravity, the reality of our circumstance did not really begin to sink in until the famous frame-filling Apollo photograph of the whole Earth, the one taken by the Apollo 17 astronauts on the last journey of humans to the moon. It seemed to me that another picture of the Earth, this one taken from 100,000 times farther away, might help in the continuing process of revealing to ourselves our true circumstance and condition. It had been well understood by the scientists and philosophers of classical antiquity that the Earth was a mere point in a vast, encompassing cosmos. But no one had ever seen it as such. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit? Yes. Settle? Not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. you.